I'm Amy Babich. I'm part of the executive committee of the WPSA, and today it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Debora Spar. Before I get to that, though, we have a couple of housekeeping things. One of them is that the push-to-talk microphones are on, and so you will be able to use them. Dr. Spar will take questions at the end if time is available. So today was good. I think I heard a lot of wonderful things, inspirational, uplifting, fantastic, everything that goes along with the theme of today and our forum, which is getting to your best. And if you stop and you think about that for a second, you think your best, because your best is not the same as her best or her best. Everybody has their own best. And what's important is that the theme was not getting to perfect. And that's one of the things that Dr. Spar is going to address. She is the author of numerous books. Her most recent is a national bestseller. It was published last year in September. Wonder Women, Sex, Power, and the Quest for Perfection is the title. It explains her own perspective and how that's changed over the years. It addresses the central paradox of the feminist movement, and she argues for more realistic goals and expectations for women. So I'm going to stop and say that I started reading the book, and it's fantastic. But just halfway through the prologue, I actually had to stop and close the book and look at it and go, I'm pretty sure this isn't about me, but let me just check again. It really hits home. I'm serious. For any professional woman, it really hits home. There are stories in there that you're going to stop and go, that happened to someone else? So I really enjoyed listening to her or reading her story because it very much relates to my story and probably all of your stories and everyone who's a professional woman and on their journey. And Dr. Spar tells it in a way that's pure and real and actually quite funny as well. So a little about her background. She graduated magna cum laude from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and went on to earn her doctorate from Harvard University. She then became a professor at the Harvard Business School, where she spent 17 years as a faculty member and has held a number of positions there, including the Spangler Family Professor of Business Administration, Director of Division of Research and Faculty Development, Senior Associate Dean for Recruiting, and then Chair of Business, Government, and International Economy Unit. She then transitioned from a very male-dominated environment at Harvard to being appointed as the 7th president of Barnard College in 2008. As Barnard College president, she serves as an academic dean within the university, and she's a vocal proponent for women's education and leadership. And she's spearheaded the initiatives that include the Athena Center, which is based on leadership studies and is an interdisciplinary center that's devoted to the theory and practice of women's leadership. She's been elected as an independent director of Goldman Sachs. She's been a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. She's a trustee of the Nightingale Bamford Schools, and in addition to writing a number of books, she has been published in the New England Journal of Medicine, Foreign Affairs, the Review of International Political Economy, among many, many others. And she has a very fantastic TED Talk that surrounds rethinking failure. And then she even braved an ice bucket challenge, I believe, last month at new student orientation at Barnard. We are absolutely delighted to have her here today, wrapping up our wonderful Women in Healthcare Forum. And I would like everyone to please join me in welcoming Dr. Debora Spar.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Amy, for that lovely introduction. I'm rarely introduced when I get to brag about having published in the New England Journal of Medicine. So I'm glad I can claim that very hard one publication. So it's great to be here. I was just saying to Amy, I've been living with a 22-year-old son all summer studying for the MCAT. So I'm just hoping I can sort of absorb some of the doctorly vibes in the room and pass them along. But it's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk with a group like you about this book that I published last year. I will pitch just once and say it's now out in paperback as of, I think, this morning. So please, they make wonderful Hanukkah, Christmas, Easter gifts. Good time to stock up. But the book starts by asking two relatively straightforward questions. The first question is sort of the obvious, somewhat statistical, quantitative question of where American women stand today. And the second question, which sort of answers itself by even posing the question, is why haven't we come any farther? You would imagine, knowing just the little bit you do about my background, that I probably started writing this book or thought about this book when I became president of Barnard College, which is a women's college, which is fairly deeply embedded in the history of feminism in this country. But that's actually not true. I started writing the book many, many years ago, sort of in the back of my mind when I was at Harvard Business School. And since the book's been out this past year, I've spoken about the book many, many times, and I've realized, for better or worse, that telling the story of how I came to write the book actually tells the story of the book itself. So if you'll indulge me for a little bit, I'm going to take a few moments, or a few minutes probably, to tell you why I happened to write this book, because I had never done anything on women's issues before. I was publishing in the New England Journal of Medicine. I was publishing in Foreign Affairs. I was one of those women who had spent all of my life actively avoiding the fact that I was a woman. Now, at a basic emotional and biological level, I was, of course, aware of this fact. But at a professional level, I ignored it. So unlike all of you good people in this room, I didn't go to any of the women's events. I didn't join the Women's Caucus. I wasn't part of the Women's Students Association anywhere I went. I just kind of pushed the entire fact of my gender to the side, believing that I could not only make it in a men's world, but if you really pushed me far enough, I probably would have admitted that I kind of thought I could do better in a man's world by not making a big deal of the fact that I was female. So I actually spent the bulk of my early career in very, very male places, doing rather male things, although I'm not a very macho person, as you can probably guess. But I was studying Soviet military technology at Georgetown, not known for its preponderance of women in the field. I then went on to study Russian and was all prepared to be a Soviet military analyst when I went to Harvard. Oddly enough, two of the people in my strange cohort of women doing Soviet military things were Anne Marie Slaughter and Condoleezza Rice. So go figure. Then the Soviet Union had the bad sense to dissolve, and we were left having to find other things to do. But true story. But that's what I was doing. And then for a long story that I won't go into, I wound up teaching at Harvard Business School, and no longer doing Soviet military things, but teaching in a place and being in a place that was very, very male. And I'm sure, like many of you, although perhaps not all of you, I got very used to the fact of always being the only woman in the room. You know, time after time after time, the only one in the seminar, the only one on the panel, the only one at the conference. And it was kind of okay, because I figured out how to do quite well in that environment. And again, in the back of my mind, there was probably some evil little fairy who was aware of the fact that I was getting some benefit from being the only woman in the room. And then, after about 15 years of this, which I'm now embarrassed to admit was a really long period of time, a couple of little events happened. And they were very little events, but they proved to be quite dramatic in my life. The first was that this perfectly nice colleague of mine called me up. Totally nice guy. And he asked me the same question that I had been asked hundreds of times by this point in my career, and I'm sure every single one of you has been asked hundreds of times. He invited me to something, I don't even remember what it was. It was like a conference or a Saturday panel or something. And he said, "Now, Deb, I know you don't know anything about the topic, but don't worry. You know, they'll love your energy, they'll love your enthusiasm, you'll do a good job." And then his voice went down a notch. He said, "And we really need a woman." All right? You've all heard this a million times. And I had heard it a million times too. But for some reason that day I cracked. And I said, "You know what, Joe? No." And I said, "And you know what else? I will never again say yes to anything if it comes attached with the words, 'and we really need a woman.'" And I must say I have been true to this vow ever since. I know I have said yes to things when what they really meant was, "and we really need a woman." But if they say those words, I'm out of there. They keep them quiet, I'm negotiable. The second thing happened was that, and you probably were not aware, there's no reason why you would have been aware of this, but you know, Harvard University is generally a pretty stable, conservative place. It doesn't change very much. But there was a period of time when there was a fair amount of tumult at the university. It's the Larry Summers years. You may have gotten whiff of some of the interesting things that were going on. But in the Larry Summers era, there was actually a lot of turmoil among the senior administrative staff of the university. And so the way this sort of trickled down to me was that there were 3 different deans over a period of time at Harvard Business School. And each one of them, in sequence, called me into their office for exactly the same conversation. Called me in, sat me down, closed the door, and said, "Deb, I know you don't do this, but I have a favor to ask. I really need you to solve the women's problem." As if there was some magic little switch that existed only in my office, and all I had to do was flick the switch, and poof, the women's problem would be solved. Now, I agreed to help solve the women's problem at Harvard Business School. And if any of you read the fabulous article by Jodi Kantor in the New York Times last summer on the fate of women at Harvard Business School, you will know that I failed dismally and did absolutely nothing to help the cause of women at Harvard Business School, but I tried. And for the first time in my life, I realized what I probably should have known all those years ago, which was that there really was a problem at Harvard Business School. It was a serious problem, and I, in fact, had lived it and experienced it all my life, even though I'd never really paid attention to it. And so very rapidly, I just started reviewing kind of the basic facts of my own life, things that, again, I had known, but I had just conveniently sort of chose to push to the sidelines. And I just went back, and at this point, I was in my, earlier mid-40s. And I thought, I had gone to Georgetown University, a very good university. I had lots of wonderful female friends, all successful, all ambitious, all smart. But here we were in our mid-40s. I was the only one who was still working, who had kids. There were 1 or 2 others who had not married and had kids, but I was the only working mother of all my friends. Then I fast-forwarded a little bit, and I looked at the women with whom I had started on the faculty at Harvard Business School. And because Harvard Business School, to its credit, was aware of the fact that they really needed women, I had started in a class of 20 assistant professors, 10 women, 10 men. And yet at the time I was asked to come in and solve the women's problem, I was the only woman who had gotten tenure. The other 9 women had fallen by the wayside. One of them subsequently came back and got tenure, but at that point I was the only one who had gotten tenure. And most of the men had gotten tenure. Not all, but in sort of bettable proportions. And then the most scary of all was that by this point in my life, I had taught literally thousands and thousands of students. Harvard Business School classes are large. You would teach 200 kids at a time. And when I looked at my students' lives and their careers, it became painfully clear that the men and the women had gone on to fundamentally different lives. Not 100% of the time. I have a couple of incredibly successful female graduates. Most of them have become close to household names, but you can count them on 1, maybe 2 hands. Whereas for men, the majority of them had gone on to become CEOs or hedge fund managers or heads of startups or managing partners. So success, professional success for men was the rule. Whereas professional success for women, even in this very rarefied world of Harvard Business School students, success for women was the anomaly. And that struck me with such power. I thought, maybe I won't write the next piece for the New England Journal of Medicine. Maybe I should look a little closer to home. And so I did a very, very, very basic statistical review. And I came up, it's not even research, it's just, Googling. Came up with, just how we do research these days in my field. I came up with the data that are stunning. And every time I speak now, I repeat these data because no matter how many times you say them, they bear repeating again. And the ugly, simple fact of the data is that pretty much in whatever sector you choose to look at in the United States, the percentage of women who hold positions of power in this sector, who are at the top of this sector, maxes out at somewhere between 15 to 20%. Just to give you a couple of numbers. 16% of law partners in this country are female. Over 50% of law students are female. But when you look at the partner level, it plummets down to 16%. 15% of members of Fortune 500 corporate boards are female. 19% of surgeons are female, although you know better than I do, the percentage of women in med school is substantially higher than 19%. 18% of congressional reps. It goes on and on and on. I call it in the book the 16% ghetto. Because what I found so stunning was not just that the numbers were low, because I kind of knew the numbers were low. What I found so stunning was how consistent they are. I would have thought going into this that you would find women at 38% in some sectors and 12 in another. But you don't. It's between 15 and 20 in pretty much every single sector, in pretty much every single country, with a few exceptions, and most of the exceptions are lower. So female engineers are at 7%. Hollywood directors are 7%. So the sheer commonality and low level of these numbers I found just sort of horrifying. Now, it's very tempting to assume or to try to argue that what explains the low numbers at the top is a pipeline problem. You hear that phrase, I hear that phrase all that time. It's a lie. It's just not true. And it hasn't been true for at least 2 generations. Because what's happening right now is that girls are dominating boys, and young women are dominating young men. So girls are doing much better than boys in high school. Boys are sitting on the couch playing video games. I have 2 of them. This is highly statistic evidence. But girls are the yearbook editors. Girls are the ones getting the academic awards. Girls are the ones who are playing 3 seasons on sports teams. Girls are going to college at higher rates than boys. 60% of college students in this country are female now. 60%. It's much higher in communities of color, which is another whole issue and problem that needs to be getting a lot more attention. Women are going into graduate schools at roughly the same rates as men. So med school is roughly 50-50. Law schools are about 50-50. It moves a little bit depending on the economy. Women are getting 78% of PhDs in the biological sciences. So the pipeline is full. And again, it's been full for nearly 30, 40 years. What's happening, and again, you all live this, so you know it, you see it, you feel it. As women go up the pyramid in pretty much every sector, they fall out, they step off, they lean out, they give up, whatever phrase you want to use, they're not there. So once I had looked at these numbers and seen it playing out in my own life, I started playing with the idea for a book that I was calling Confessions of a Reluctant Feminist. Now, that's actually still the real title of this book, because it is a confessional book. It's not only more autobiographical than I ever expected it to be, but it is my sort of mea culpa for saying, wow, I probably should have taken a single course in feminist theory somewhere along the line, as president of a women's college. So that's the confessions. And I come to my feminism reluctantly. And it's not because I think feminism's a bad thing. It's because I thought we didn't need it anymore. I thought this era was over. And so the book is this confessional take and an examination of why, in my opinion, we still need feminism. Just a little sidebar here. When time came to sell the book, it was made very clear to me very quickly that no publisher in New York would publish a book that had the word feminist in the title, because nobody wants to buy a book that has the word feminism in the title. So my book now has sex in the title, because it turns out, surprise, surprise, people will actually buy books on feminism as long as they have sex in the title. But the real title is Confessions of a Reluctant Feminist. All right, I want to tell you one more little story, and then I will get into the actual meat of the book. It's a silly story, but it captures in part why I wrote this book, and it gives you a feel to what Amy was said earlier about sort of how the book actually tells its argument. So the story occurred on sort of a random day 12 years ago when I was at home working, because one of the great advantages of my job is that kind of once a week I can stay at home and write, and I get to do that. So I was home, and you people might particularly appreciate this and hate me for telling you the story I'm about to tell you, but I was giving a presentation that night at Harvard Medical School on stem cell technologies, a topic about which I know kind of nothing. But somehow somebody had been convinced that I was the person to talk to all of these, folks like you, very intelligent medical practitioners on stem cell technologies. And I'm pretty good at winging most presentations, but I can't wing stem cell technologies. So I had given myself a full day to get at least sufficiently up to speed so I could say something that wasn't totally naive about this rather complicated topic. So I've had an office on the 3rd floor of my house, so I'm up there and I'm just starting to, get my thoughts organized. And all of a sudden, my eldest son starts running up and down the stairs, kind of ballistic and hysterical, because he was writing his college essay applications and had forgotten like everything useful, like his social security number, my social security number, what he wanted to do with his life, all of these easy questions, and I was the only one who could help him. So he's going up and down the stairs. Then as I'm dealing with him, son number 2 calls, who was then in high school, and he said very gruffly, I've got 42 after-school activities today, 3 ball games. You need to drive me to all of them, but you're not going to be able to reach me because I just dropped my cell phone under a moving car. So figure it out, Mom. And then my daughter called, the sweet one, and told me that she had forgotten her Hebrew school homework and her piano book and her soccer uniform, and could I somehow find a way to bring all of these to school by, an hour from now. So I'm watching my stem cell presentation, sort of fade ever further into the distance. And at this moment, the cat shows up with a half-dead chipmunk in her little mouth. Now, like a dead chipmunk, I could have handled. But this thing was half dead. And unlike you all, I have no practical skills. So she drops this thing on the rug where it's expiring with this little dying chipmunk breaths. And I'm just staring at it because I have no idea what I'm going to do with this bleeding rodent on my oriental rug. And as I'm just literally staring at this thing, my husband calls. Now, my husband was in Buffalo, and it was like October. And the plan was he was going to get home from Buffalo to deal at least with the evening stuff, because I had to give a presentation on stem cell technologies at Harvard Medical School. And instead, he says in his very, very sweet voice, there's been some kind of a freak snowstorm in Buffalo, and the airports are closed, and the car rental places are closed, and the roads are closed, and he's not going to be home for like 9.5 weeks. But he says very sweetly, is there anything I can do? This is the point at which I was ready to kill someone. And the rest of the day just unraveled from that point. I tried to figure out what to do with this poor chipmunk. I put it in a shoebox. I gave it cat food, which seemed like, some kind of moral making up. And I threw the cat out the window, and I got one kid here, and I got one kid there. And I totally faked my presentation at Harvard Medical School, and instead spent my evening asking all the doctors what to do about a dead, dying chipmunk, because I figured I'd get something out of the evening, come home, and of course, the chipmunk has died, which just seemed like the ultimate injury on a really bad day. And this was the moment which I thought, either I'm going to truly kill someone, or I'll do the only other thing I know to do in moments of stress, which is to write. So thankfully, I chose the nonviolent option. And I just wrote the story of what had happened to me this day, and I felt better. I stuck it in a drawer, and I kind of forgot about it. Fast forward, I left Harvard, I moved to New York, I took this job at Barnard, and my first year at Barnard, the Wall Street Journal came up with this really brilliant, totally sadistic idea. And those of you who have teenagers of a certain age will appreciate this. They decided the week before colleges released their admissions, which selections, they asked 10 college presidents to agree to write one of their own application essays. And it's nasty, but smart. The deal was you had to agree to write the essay before they told you what the essay was. So I thought, oh, this is clever. I'll do this. It'll be good for Barnard. So I said yes. And then they give me, of course, which is the worst essay question in the world. Please describe an average day in your life and how you find solace from routine. A question I should tell you is no longer on the Barnard admissions packet, but it was at that point. And so it's a horrible question, but I know enough about college essays, and the trick is you never answer the question, you turn it on its head. So somehow I remembered my dead chipmunk story. So I truly took the dead chipmunk story verbatim, and I wrote like 3 sentences on top of it, saying, I wish I had an average day. But as every working mother knows, there's no such thing as routine. And I tacked on the chipmunk story. Now, and sent it off to the Wall Street Journal, where it was published with 9 other very serious scholarly essays. And the funny thing was, at this point, I was doing a lot of conferences. I was talking about, serious things. And yet, for years, I would show up at events and people would go, "You're the dead chipmunk lady, right?" And of all the things I'd written in my life, nothing ever struck a chord like that stupid story of the dead chipmunk. And it made me realize something, that even though I had had a day that was so idiosyncratic, a day that nobody else on the planet had ever experienced, every single working mother had had exactly that day. And even, to be fair, a fair number of working fathers and, working mothers, working women without children. The day just captured what it feels like far too often when you're trying to do your job for which you're relatively well qualified, and yet you can't, because your life is just unraveling around you. And this was not tragedy, it wasn't chaos, it was just one of those, it happens all the time. Your life is just unraveling around you. And so when I sat down to actually write my book on Confessions of a Reluctant Feminist, I decided to make the book like the chipmunk story. It's not all about dead rodents, but it is about bringing the lives of women into a more academic examination of women. Because having, by this point, spent enough time sort of looking at the problem and the socioeconomic and the demographic issues, what struck me, and I can't tell you whether this is right or wrong, it just felt right to me, what's really killing women is just the chaos of their lives. And no one was writing about that. So I know you've spent all day trying to figure out how to be your best. My book is really about giving up. And this is the lean out version. And I'm exaggerating, as you'll see here. I'm not telling women to give up or lean out or not strive for greatness. What I'm saying is be reasonable, be realistic. Nobody has it all. I don't know where the phrase "having it all" came from, but it's a horrible phrase. We need to get rid of it. And we need to realize that if we as human beings are going to be juggling all the things we now juggle, this is what our lives are going to look like. And we have to acknowledge that instead of doing what I think women are constantly doing all the time, which is beating themselves up for not being better. So that's the backdrop of the book. And so let me just tell you, somewhat more seriously, sort of how it evolves. Once I decided to make the book at least quasi-autobiographical, which was kind of a big risk, I realized that the timing, the chronology was really important. Because if I was telling my story, what became important, of course, was how old I am and what year I was born. And it turns out that the year in which we're born as women at this point in time, I think, is quite important. Because the generations after feminism are really, really narrow. And women who were born just 10 years before or after me, in general, have fundamentally different experiences of and with feminism. So I was born in 1963, which turns out to be a really interesting year in the history of feminism. 1963 is the year that Betty Friedan's book comes out, The Feminist Mystique, which really turns out to be one of these books that changes everything. I was giving a version of this talk to a much older audience in New York a couple of months ago, and a woman came up to me afterwards and she says, "I have to tell you what happened. I was in a book group in 1963. We all read Betty Friedan's book. We all went out and got jobs the next week, and the book club never met again." That's a very powerful story. That's how powerful that book was. And right after that book came out in 1963, not because of it, but just because 1963 was a very tumultuous moment in American history. Look at what happened for the next 5 to 10 years. Civil rights movement really reaches its apogee. Martin Luther King is assassinated. John F. Kennedy is assassinated. Woodstock happens and then kind of disappears. Free love happens and kind of disappears. The pill becomes widely available. Roe v. Wade is passed. Essentially, the sexual revolution happened between the time I was born and when I was around 10. And women of my generation were too young to stay up for any of it. We missed it. Because by the time we became teenagers, which is the time you become, vaguely sociologically and politically aware, it was over. we had birth control. We had access to reproductive rights. We could have premarital sex without thinking all that much about it. And so women of my generation, in general, we didn't become feminists. This is the mea culpa part of my excusing why I never took a single course. But I'm not alone. We know the data, too. Women of my age do not tend to be big donors to things like Planned Parenthood, whereas women 10 years older are. Now, this may change tragically. We're starting, to see a new surge of activism. But women my age tended not to identify ourselves as feminists. Why? We didn't need the feminists anymore. And by the time I was about 10 or 15, if you start reading the mainstream descriptions of feminism, they're not very attractive. If you're a 13, 14-year-old girl, reading Time magazine in 1976, 77, you would walk away presuming that all feminists are ugly, they never shave their legs, they're angry all the time, and they hate men. Now, it turns out that none of this was actually true. But if you're 13 and 14, whatever's in the media is what you presume to be true. And so I think many girls of my age grew up believing they didn't want to be feminists, and feminists were their mothers. No teenager wants to be what her mother is. It's just not cool by definition. And instead, the images that we saw on television and in the media were things like this. Okay? If you're a certain age, you remember this ad, okay? This is for Charlie Perfume. This is one of the greatest ads of all time. The perfume went on to become one of the best-selling products of all time. It's not because the perfume is good. The perfume's terrible. But the ad is amazing because look at what they're selling here. They're not selling perfume. They're selling the image of the modern woman. They don't have to tell you that. You just look at this image and you say, this is the modern woman. What is the modern woman? She's gorgeous, sexy, young. You want that? Yeah. Gorgeous, sexy, young is good. What do gorgeous, sexy, young women do? Well, they're working women. And a male name. And kind of a male wardrobe, right? This is when pantsuits, hard to believe, were very fashionable. But we know this woman is going to work. How do we know she's going to work? She has a briefcase. Now, notice the briefcase. This is not a heavy briefcase that is dragging her down. This is not a briefcase full of work she didn't get done last night. She just has a briefcase, and she's going to work. And in another version of this, I am not making this up, she's got a briefcase in one hand and a baby in the other. And you do not know where she is taking the baby. You are not worried that this child is sick and may have subpar child care. You just know that she's got a baby and she's going to work and somehow it's all going to work out. And at the end of the day, in the television version of this, she's in a bar, the baby's gone, the briefcase is gone, and there's this really attractive man singing at her and squirting her with perfume. I thought this was going to be my life. Okay? Now, I may have been particularly shallow as a child. But if this is all you're seeing, this is what you aspire to. And if every single older person in your life, every teacher, every parent, every neighbor is saying, you can be whatever you want. I couldn't be a doctor, but you could. In my generation, women couldn't be lawyers, but you can. You just presume, if you're smart and, lucky enough in this country, that this is the world you're going to waltz into. Now, just to make it even worse, of course, this was not the only Charlie image that we had in my youth. We also had these fabulous Charlie women, the Charlie's Angels. Now, again, this is absurd, right? This is fantasy. But it's kind of nice fantasy. And think again of what the fantasy was. These are working women in 1976. And what does it mean to be a working woman in 1976? Well, A, you're gorgeous. B, you are ridding the world of evil. C, you have a male boss whom you never see. And D, you go to work in a bikini. Okay? Now again, I was not quite so dumb to think that my life would be like this, but I thought it might be a little bit close. And again, if you go back, I did a lot of this research, which was actually fascinating. I looked at all the TV shows I watched in the 1970s. They're all selling fairly similar aspirations. Now, let me just give a huge caveat here.
as you know, because this book becomes so autobiographical in parts, my age is not the only thing that's important. You know, who I am is also important. So I am writing from the perspective of someone who's white, who's upper middle class, who never had to worry about being poor and is, you know, overly educated. So one of the things I argue in the book is that there's no single feminism that can speak to all women. We need different branches because women have such different lived experiences. I think we all have chipmunk stories, but we really need to break it down, and particularly look at the cultural influences. Because if you don't watch these shows, you were influenced as a kid in very different ways. But I do think the cultural influences that surround us are crucial. So what I argue in the book, now I really am going to get more serious here, is because women of my generation grew up not wanting to be feminists, because we grew up with these kinds of media images around us, we made two crucial mistakes as a generation. The first was that we privatized feminism. Feminism was not about this. Feminism wasn't about making women gorgeous and sexy and successful. Feminism was a collective struggle. It was about working for a common good. That's what the feminism of the 60s was about. By the time you hit the 80s, we privatized feminism, and we made it about the quest for personal perfection. And if you look more broadly at what was happening in this country, there was a massive societal shift between 1968, Woodstock and free love and civil rights, and 1980, which was the Reagan era. There's 12 years between Woodstock and Reagan, but it's a massive social shift, and I think feminism underwent that same shift. It was my generation that made feminism about me, about my personal goals, my success, my aspiration. The second, in many ways, worst mistake we made was that we ratcheted up the expectations placed on women. This was not because anybody was trying to do this, it just kind of happened. But think of what happened. For hundreds, if not thousands of years, women had a very finite set of expectations placed upon them. Women were supposed to be relatively attractive, get married, have babies, and cook. That was kind of it. And you can do that in a 40-hour week. It may not be a lot of fun, it may not be very exciting, but you can do it. Then, in the 1960s, 70s, and 1980s, because of feminism, we created this marvelous new set of expectations for women. You can be a surgeon, you can be an astronaut, you can be an astrophysicist. That's wonderful. But we never got rid of the older expectations. No one ever said, oh, and now you don't have to get married and have babies and look good and cook. So rather than making women's lives easier in any way, we doubled or tripled the expectations that we place on women. And sadly now, when I look at my students, it hasn't gotten better. In fact, it's actually gotten worse. Because at least like when I was growing up, I didn't also have to be an athlete. You know, I could skip every gym class and, you know, it worked very, very well. But now, you know, girls are expected to be on the traveling soccer team by the time they're 4. We're saying, be a scientist, but wear a tutu. You know, play with blocks, but play with dolls. By the time they show up in college, they're exhausted. I mean, it's really my biggest concern with this generation is they're exhausted. The boys too, but the girls way more than the boys. Because the boys kind of say, forget it, I'm going on the couch and playing video games. The girls are sucking all this stuff in, and they're trying to be perfect all the time at everything. And that's what once I switched the title of this book, that's what I call the Wonder Woman myth. It's the myth that we all are subjected to, and this does, I think, cut across socioeconomic, color, racial, religious lines. We all somehow feel we have to be Wonder Woman all the time in every single sphere of our lives. Men don't have this as much because we tend to value and assess men on whatever they're good at, and we don't lob in everything else. You know, when people are talking about Lloyd Blankfein and Jamie Dimon as sort of competing CEOs, nobody ever asks, but who's a better father? Right? Nobody even questions whether they have children. And yet, anytime there's a conversation about a female CEO, we always know all of her childcare arrangements. It's just, you know, it's taken as a given. And let me give you one example. It's a silly example, but I find it so incredibly powerful. So this is Marion Bartoli. You may recall, she won the women's singles championship at Wimbledon last summer. She was 24 years old, French, spent all of her life playing tennis, and it was an unexpected win. So here she is, she shows up, she wins, and she goes for her first major televised interview. It was with the BBC, a serious, you know, interviewer. And her dad had been her coach all the way through her career. So the interviewer sits her down and he says, "So, Marion, tell me, I guess at some point in time your father turned to you and said, well, you'll never be a looker, so you might as well play tennis." First line out of his mouth. Here she is at a moment which probably none of us will ever experience. She is the best in the world at her chosen pursuit, and yet the first thing the interviewer feels empowered to ask her about is her looks. This stuff doesn't happen to men. It happens to women every single day. So what I do in the book, and I'll go through this very, very quickly now, is I organize it around the stages of a woman's life. And at each stage in our lives, I ask these questions about expectations and about changes in expectations. So I start by looking at girls and how we raise girls. And I just gave you a sense of this. In the bad old days, girls didn't have a lot of expectations, but we didn't ask a lot of them. We said to little girls, play with tea sets and be pretty. Now we're confusing the heck out of them with blocks and science and soccer and tutus and ballet. And I really think we are exhausting girls, not to mention the sexual pressure that they're under from about the age of 4, so far as I can tell. Then there's a chapter, which is no news, but it's depressing old news, on beauty. One of the things that feminism was supposed to do was to get rid of the expectation that women would be valued only for their looks. How far have we come on this? Nowhere. If anything, I would argue we've gone back. That the thanks in part to medical advances, we're supposed to look 17 from the time we're 3 until we're 94. At least in Manhattan, where I live, where I am positive it is illegal to have a wrinkle. They stop you on the bridge and they don't let you in. And it creates just this massive other set of things to worry about. And somebody, when I was railing about this someday someone said to me, yeah, but at least we don't have to have corsets. I said, And then I thought about it, and I said, hang on a second. This is what we're supposed to look like with a corset on. But the corset was doing all the work, right? You put it on, you were miserable, and then you took it off. Now we're supposed to have the corset body without the corset, which means gym, starving, anorexia, and Spanx. So I'm just not sure we've come anywhere on this one. Then the book looks at sex, which was a horrifying chapter to have to write, particularly as the president of a women's college. But what I argue in the sex chapter, and I really thought I would get attacked primarily by my students, but I actually wasn't. I argued that I'm not sure the changing sexual norms have actually benefited women. And the norms I'm talking to here, and with apologies to all of you who have teenage children whom I'm about to freak out, but the sexual norm on college campuses is hooking up. It's very promiscuous, often anonymous, as we're now sadly learning, occasionally violent sex. If this is what young women really want, power to them. But it turns out that most young women don't want uncommitted, anonymous, promiscuous sex. They actually want relationships. In the bad old days, at least, a woman gave sex in exchange for something, like marriage, or at least dinner and a movie. And and now there's nothing. So again, I say this with some trepidation, but I'm not sure we've come out on the right side of this. Then there's a chapter on marriage, where I raised the question that I can't quite answer, although I've been very happily married for nearly 28 years, despite the Buffalo incident. Why do we still get married? Marriage is basically an economic contract. If you read any traditional wedding ceremony, it's basically an economic transaction. The bride is given in exchange for something. We're beyond that. And yet, why are we not only getting married, although just in the past couple of years, the rates have really started to go down, but we're fetishizing the white wedding. The whole symbol of which is hearkening back to an era that makes no sense anymore. And once you throw gay marriage in the mix, I just find it fascinating. I'm a huge proponent of gay marriage, but that gay couples would be embracing a ceremony that doesn't even make sense for heterosexual couples anymore. And the argument I make, and I really have no idea if this is true, but I put it out there, I think marriage has actually gotten much harder over the past few decades. Because again, in the bad old days, we didn't expect much from it. It was an economic relationship. I cook, I bear the children, you bring home the bison or whatever needs to be brought home. But now we're expected to, cook and saute the bison and make sure it's organic and free range and have madly passionate sex until we die at 105 after having had promiscuous hookup sex for the first 30 years of our life. So I think it's actually gotten more complicated. And I think rather than acknowledging that it's getting more complicated, we just focus on the wedding, because that's easy. The marriage is the part that's actually much harder. The next chapter looks at babies. And here I do